Hi, everybody. This is Uma Mishra-Newberry. I'm the Executive Director of Women's March Global. This whole month of May, we are now on the 4 out of our 5 actions to end violence against women. We've been running monthly actions, directly telling the stories of women across the world and their experiences in regards to violence against women. This is based upon the January anniversary march, where that was our theme. So this month in May, what we have been doing is holding community discussions with our chapters and our members across the globe. Just a couple of days ago, we had a conversation with Women's March India. Last week, we had a conversation with Women's March Kingston in Jamaica. And the whole point of these conversations is to really share the stories of women and help people understand that what a woman experiences in one part of the world is very similar to the experiences of a woman in another part of the world, and that women's issues are not siloed. All oppression is connected, and all of these experiences are also connected. So with that being said, today I have with me Jamie Evans from Women's March Sydney. Jamie, thank you so much for taking the time to join me in this conversation. Sydney and the whole of Australia is going through a moment right now. You have the elections coming up on Saturday. How are you feeling about it?
I think cautiously optimistic is fair to say. We're hoping for the best. Everyone's, it's at the point now where everyone's done all of the work that they pretty much can do. So now it's just waiting for the results. I think there's a mood of optimism. It feels like it's going to go the way we're hoping for. But I also think that if we learnt nothing from the last few years, maybe it's don't get too ahead of yourself. So I don't think anybody's celebrating yet. A little nervous is fair to say, but cautiously optimistic. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I've seen some of the things that have come up in regards to, especially the few women MPs that you have in Parliament and the experiences that they are having and how they're also being labeled. Can you talk a little bit about the environment of toxic misogyny and patriarchy, especially within the government, and what's happening in regards to that?
Yeah, unfortunately, it has been a big theme of the election. In a way, it's good to get it out there in the open and talk about it, but the fact that it's still an issue is not only incredibly disappointing, but quite disheartening. It's, one of our big themes is that in order to have the legislation that's going to benefit women, you need the representation there. But the problem is, you do have these women who are ready and eager to run, and then they encounter these attitudes and this misogyny, and it very quickly becomes a deterrent. And that's why we find that a lot of women don't necessarily want to keep pushing through that. And that's completely understandable, because it really is, it's just toxic. The party that's in power at the moment, our government, has very, very few female ministers. I think it's 23% of their entire government is female ministers, which is, it's actually gone down from what it was previously. We've had some pretty high profile female leaders leave the party saying that even within their own party, they don't think that their ideas were respected. They don't think they were being listened to. And they've quite openly said that a lot of it, they believe, is to do with sexism, misogyny. So when you've got people within their own party saying that, that just goes to show how much of a problem it is. We're talking quite high ranking. Our foreign minister, for example, was held in quite high regard and considered incredibly competent. All of these, there was no question about whether she could do the job or not, whether it was necessarily a party that we entirely agreed with on a fundamental level, but there was no question about the competency of this woman. There was no question about whether she could do the job or not. And when it came to a time to elect a new leader for that party, it was never even considered that she might be a candidate. And it was purely because there's still this attitude that women can't do it. And that's just, it's utterly ridiculous, but it just keeps coming up constantly. And then we're getting, it becomes incredibly personal in a way that I don't think that it does become for male politicians. There's these questions of, women in power. Well, who's looking after the family then? Who's taking care of the kids? What about these children? But these questions aren't asked of their male counterparts. So it just all builds up into this pressure and this completely unnecessary narrative of, well, as a woman, you can't do the job for whatever reason. And we all know that it's not true. The majority of the country know that it's not true, but it seems like within the actual government and within these, particularly this one party, the attitude just will not go away. And it's really disappointing to see.
Now, I mean, there's so much that we can talk about within regards to what is happening in Australia, but I do want to bring up and highlight the fact that Women's March Sydney, you all have been doing a huge amount of advocacy work and education and awareness work. I remember very powerfully last year watching the live stream of a vigil that you held after the murder, I believe it was, of Eurydice Dixon. Is that correct? And
Yeah, that's correct.
can you talk a little bit about specifically that situation, but then also, what you've been experiencing in terms of the violence that women experience in Australia?
Yeah, well, right off the bat, the saddest fact is that that's not the last vigil that we've attended lately. It's not the last vigil that's been held. We're at the point now where our attitude is very much that it's at a national crisis level. Violence against women is at the point where we're quite comfortable labeling it a national crisis. Our government not so comfortable with that label, but from the feedback that we've been getting from the public as well, we think that it's at the point where it's just unacceptable. It's statistically at the moment, we're looking at, on average, one woman a week is killed by a current or a former partner. Last year, it was 69 women were killed as a result of gendered violence. We're not a particularly large country in Australia. That number is way disproportional, and it's just it doesn't show any signs of slowing down yet. And it's just I mean, it's in the public conversation now, but we still think not enough. We're holding these vigils. It's great that people are coming out and being supportive, but the fact that as we were preparing for the march in January, I think 2 days beforehand, there was another woman who was killed violently, and it was because she was a woman. The fact that it just happens so frequently now that it's always incredibly heartbreaking when it happens, but it's not necessarily surprising when it happens, I think is one of the worst parts of it. And on a policy level and on a public conversation level, it's just not being given the level of attention that we think an issue like this deserves. It's, there are a lot of things that in this country we'd like to talk about. There's, as with anywhere, there's a lot of issues, but it just doesn't seem to be reaching that same level of attention, of conversation, of, especially from a legislative point of view from the government, that same response that we expect with other, we talk about something like a potential terrorist threat or something like that. It's dealt with immediately. The government are incredibly quick to jump on it and say, well, this is how we're going to deal with this. We're going to legislate. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. It's not acceptable. But the rates that these women are dying is far higher. And yet the response is incredibly lacking. So that's been one of the key points of the vigils, is just saying, we know that we're heartbroken by this. We know that other people, the public, are heartbroken by this. We don't want to see it happen anymore, but we need more to be done about it on a policy level and to have that national conversation about what the attitudes are around women, that it seems like it's so acceptable.
Mm. A couple of days ago, and correct me if I'm wrong here, I saw a really horrific video out of Melbourne of a man, and I think it was his partner, you know, there was an intense physical violence, and he ran his car through the convenience station or store, and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but possibility of parole after 3.5 years. And she was pregnant during this attack. And a lot of the media that came out after that was just stunned at the fact that the leniency shown towards this man. And you and I have spoken before just about the embedded misogyny that is in Australia. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because when you're talking about the fact that 2 days before the anniversary march in January, there was yet another violent attack done by a partner, what is leading to so many of these deaths, so many of these murders?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big part of what makes it so hurtful to see and so difficult to try to change, because it's one thing to push for increased funding or more legislation and obviously those are all things that we want. They're all part of our greater asks, but one of the really hard things to do is get to that cultural attitude of why is it considered acceptable, or why is it not a behavior that's being called out more often by friends or just other. There was a big discussion after a couple of the high profile murders last year about what is the role of men in this conversation, and it was very much saying, well, you need to step up. There needs to be more calling out, because it can start quite small. It's the sexist jokes, it's the attitudes, it's those things that then make it seem like it's acceptable, because it's not that far of a step really. Once you're normalizing considering women as lesser than you, then that's where these attitudes grow. And we've talked a lot about that with the murders that have been happening, or the violent acts against women. A lot of the time when it's reported, it seems to be this story of, well, he was a good guy, but he snapped, or he was pushed to it, or, what was it that made him get to this point? And the reality is, if you're a person who's gone out and murdered somebody, or been violent towards somebody, or any of these kind of horrible acts, then you're not a good person. It's not that you just got pushed too far and snapped. I think there's too much trying to look at, oh well, what was it that happened, why they're too stressed, or they're whatever it might be. But that does a real disservice. First of all, it does a real disservice to the victims, because it's essentially saying, well, was it in part their fault, which is obviously ridiculous and incredibly hurtful. But then when you look at it from that lens and try to talk about, good men who've snapped, or how it is that they got pushed too far, I think you're negating a lot of the blame that should be put in the right place, which is at these misogynistic attitudes and the level of entitlement that you must feel to think that that's acceptable. And that's, I mean, a big part of that is also the way that these things are reported in media. And I do think it's getting a little better, but definitely got a very long way to go. But yet one of the things that we've been most disappointed at and really want to call out is these ideas of, well, he was a family man, and here are these photos of him with his children and smiling, and everything was fine until one day it just wasn't. But that's not the way it goes. There's these underlying attitudes. There's a lot that you can look at to talk about. Yeah, it's fair enough to discuss why it happened, but I don't think it's fair enough to discuss it in a way that takes the blame away from A, the perpetrator, and B, the underlying misogyny that makes it seem like it's not that big of a deal, or it's not that common, or there's this sort of, well, if we label him as just the bad guy who snapped and did wrong, then I don't have to look at my own behaviors and see whether I hold attitudes that are also misogynistic. And we're at the point now in this country where it's happening frequently enough that I do think it's more than fair for everyone to be having a good look and thinking, well, how am I perpetrating these notions?
Mm-hmm. What do you see as the shift that will help? move this conversation forward? Because so much of, especially when we're talking about toxic misogyny, um, lies at the feet of men to change that conversation, change those behaviors. Because they are the ones that are in power, they are the ones that are passing laws, they are the ones that are giving lenient sentences to other men who commit acts of violence against women. What do you see as the thing that can change, um, that fabric?
I think, I mean, a big part of it, as with everything, is just education. It's getting it out there, and they might not be comfortable conversations to have, but they're conversations that we need to be having as a nation, as a group of friends, as just, you know, having a look within yourself and thinking about, well, have I maybe perpetrated these attitudes over time? Maybe not necessarily with, any sort of malice, but at the end of the day, it's still perpetrating these notions. So I think a big part of it is always going to be education. I think we have been seeing a shift. Sadly, it has come about from just the sheer volume of these horrible events that are happening. It's unfortunate that it's the loss of more lives that is the catalyst for everybody getting this conversation started. But it does seem like the more it happens and the more understanding there is around, these people who have lost their lives, or these people who are the victims, they're in no way deserving of anything that's happened. It's not like it was just, oh, she pushed him too far, or he was having a hard time. It's just that, these people didn't deserve anything that's happened to them. And the more it gets out there, these stories, as hard as they are to hear, I think there is becoming a little bit of a public sort of reckoning with the way that we talk about things, the way that we talk about women's place in society. With an election coming up as well, it has been a big discussion. It's that sort of thing where it's always painful to have a look at your own failings on a personal level or on a national level or on a cultural level, but it's only fair to have to do that. So I think, yeah, partially it's education. The other part of it, like we were saying earlier, it's the representation. If you have more women making these laws, if you have more women having a say in, how we're going to fund these issues, how we're going to discuss these issues, how we're going to publicize these issues, then you're going to get a better voice for what we need to be discussing. And then I think it's just, as much as it's been a really hard time with going through all of the, it feels like you're just constantly hearing these sad stories and another loss of life, and it's all just so senseless. But one of the good things that we've seen from having the event in January and doing other events is that the public attitudes are shifting more towards not just, well, obviously this is something that's wrong, but also, well, what can we do about it? And the more I think we put the pressure on and we don't let it just, it's easy for something to be in the news for 1 day or 2 days, but then something else comes along and it's not such a big deal anymore. I think the more it gets discussed out in public and the more people are calling out these attitudes as they see them, whether it's at the ultimate level of, a woman's life being taken, or whether it is just a way that a female politician has been treated that's clearly misogynistic, or a comment that was made that was sexist, or anything like that. The more it's being held up and called out, it's going to be in conversation more frequently. Then we can sort of keep at it and say to people, well, you can see these examples, you can see how this one thing leads to another thing, you can see where the attitudes are coming from, and we know that it's not right, we've got a long way to go on it, but if we keep working at it, hopefully we'll get there.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the questions that we are asking every single one of our community members in these webinars is, this is, of course, broadcast to a global audience and our community is global. What do you want people to know that are listening to this that are outside of Australia in regards to the experiences Women's March Sydney is seeing on the ground with respect to violence against women, and also even with the upcoming elections. I mean, Australia is a country that many of us don't necessarily think about because it's so far away. Um, but but the impact that it does have is massive at times in terms of the laws that are passed. And we talk a lot about gun regulation in the wake of New Zealand and what happened between New Zealand and Australia, and the gunmen coming from Australia to New Zealand, and the gun laws around the world and how that shifted. So these are global conversations. So that is my question to you. What is, in a very long-winded way, what is the thing that you would want people to or you would want to leave people with?
I think ultimately a lot of what it comes down to is that it's a very universal feeling, this, the idea that there is still this level of misogyny, there's still this level of sexism. Sometimes it manifests itself in violence, sometimes it's not so overt, but it's still really insidious. All of those sorts of feelings are unfortunately very global. We do think that, within Australia at the moment, we're sort of at that point of reckoning with it, because it's at such a high level. It's become a leading cause of disability, of illness, of premature death for women. It's something that needs to be looked at as sort of a health crisis, but at the same time, the attitudes that we're dealing with around the election, or just this general cultural attitude, unfortunately, the reason why Women's March exists on a global scale, and why we might be incredibly far away from a chapter in, say, London or the US, for example, but we know exactly what the feeling is like when you hear somebody else talk about this. It's because these sort of attitudes are everywhere. And I think that's what everybody's working towards in the end. So for Australia, and for Sydney in particular, although we may have our own specific goals and things that we're sort of looking at, with the election coming up, there's the good thing that we will say is that public pressure is sort of starting to manifest itself. There's been some good policies coming out around domestic violence. One of the major parties is proposing essentially doubling the current funding, and it's being suggested in a way that makes sense. It's not just throwing money out and it being wasted. It's going towards the frontline services. It's actually, so the pressure is working. It's not quite as fast as we would like, but it is working. But yeah, for us in Sydney, I suppose what we would want everyone else to know is that we know what it's like. I think that's a part of why Women's March as a movement, as a global thing, has been so popular and well received, is because everybody understands that feeling of, thinking that maybe you've been passed over for a job, and that you were just as qualified as the man, or if it's just a sexist comment, or anything like that. Unfortunately, we see the same thing, we feel the same thing. We're sort of, I think, as a country, at a point where we're really trying to deal with how we sit on a global scale, being so far away but still being such a part of the global community. And a big part of that is looking at where your own shortcomings are, and New Zealand was a big part of that. It's undoubtedly, I think, a shameful thing when you hear that a person who's done something that horrible has come from within your own community, and you want to have a look and think, well, why is that? And I will say we've been it's easy, I think, to sort of bury these things away and not want to discuss them. Australia's pretty well known for having that fairly easygoing attitude. It'll be fine, don't worry about it, we're all good. But no, we're not. Nobody is. The world's in a bit of a place at the moment where there's a lot of things that we need to deal with, and we're working on that too. I think we're proud to see that it is happening, but there's still a long way to go. So, unfortunately.
Thank you so much for your time. And, we're going to be watching the election outcomes tomorrow. And I know, how much work you and the Women's March Sydney team have been doing to really spread awareness of the vote, um, and get people out to vote. So thank you so much for all of your hard work, but also for your time in this discussion. And we are keeping our fingers crossed for the best outcome for this weekend.
We all are. Thank you.
Thank you.